So I'm Mark, out of the group of the three men with Animal Think Tank. So we've been exploring for some time at Animal Think Tank a long-term objective that we want to achieve. So something maybe in 25, 40, 80 years. And how to achieve that, like the strategy. So we've sort of done a large consultation with about 60 sort of key players in the movement, and identified that the movement seems to have like 9 explicit or implicit long-term objectives. And so we've been trying to work out, okay, so how would we get there? What would be the best way to get to each one? And then that would give us a sense of, okay, which may be the most promising to pursue. It's hard work. I can't get my head around it a lot of the time. Which is the best one? How would we do it? And we totally rely on people who've been thinking about this for maybe even decades. So we've got on the panel people who have been thinking about it for a long time and been doing it as well. So we're just going to look at or just explore 3 of these objectives and strategies. And the pros and cons, and maybe a little bit about how we can do them. So I'm going to go to Brigitte, and I change how I say your name, I think, every day. So, I mean, I'm so excited by what you've been doing in Finland, and so you're going to talk about sort of fundamental rights, and rights is something we talk about all the time. Oh, let's give animals rights, but then, what is that? How would we do it? So you're choosing to chase fundamental rights. So maybe you want to explain a little bit about why fundamental rights.
Yes, thank you, and good morning to everyone. Nice to have you here on Sunday morning. Yes, we have chosen to go for fundamental animal rights, and that means that we try to make fundamental changes in the society through recognizing fundamental animal rights in the Finnish constitution. I'm coming from a civil law country, so your approach is, of course, a little bit different than ours. Of course, one can ask why fundamental animal rights, and to put it simple, if we want to see fundamental changes in the society, what we obviously want to see, we need to go for fundamental changes. And with that said, I don't say that we need to only do that. We need to do many other things along the way, because this is a long-term goal. As you all know, I think to make changes in the constitution, it's a long run. So, and I also think that welfare requirements and talks and actions about the well-being of animals and human-animal relations, fundamental animal rights, even if they would be recognized in the constitution, it doesn't exclude those actions. So, but to put it shortly, why fundamental animal rights? They give reference in situation of conflicts. They can limit other fundamental rights, humans or animals, and they also is binding for the legislator, government, and persons, individuals, human individuals. Just to give few of the reasons why we have chosen to work for that. We are at the same time in the Finnish Animal Rights Law Society cooperating, also helping other NGOs with legal issues, and we give statements on different animal issues in the country. So even if our main task is to get fundamental animal rights recognized in the Finnish constitution, it's not the only thing we do. We want to support in the big picture everyone working for something good, whatever that then might be, in the context of law, of course. So I think that is shortly put it.
So I'm just going to check my understanding. We've been chatting the last 2 days. So you have a bill in Parliament, which is to change the constitution to incorporate fundamental rights. And so the way I've understood that is fundamental rights for animals is equivalent to a human rights bill.
Yes, so even if I said that it's a long run to recognize fundamental animal rights, during my lifetime, I thought that I will not see such a change, or even that we could have a serious talk with the MPs and that the Parliament would really dig into the content of fundamental animal rights. But in 2023, we had a citizens' initiative that we filed in Finland, and we needed 50,000 signatures, and we got almost 53,000, and we filed it to the Parliament, and at the moment it is at the Constitutional Committee at the Parliament for development and discussion, and we are waiting for their statement. Or actually, before the statement, we will be heard, and there will be a public hearing concerning the proposal. And the content is exactly what we have proposed in our work. So let's see. I hope to see it during my lifetime, that it would be black letter law in the Constitution, but let's see how it goes. And if it's not successful this time, we will file it again. So it's not the end of the story. Thank you.
Yeah, we're talking about the long term, and I think that you've got this bill into Parliament to be considered has given me a lot of hope. But it's also challenged me, because we talk about long term, but your group actually only came together in 2018, I think, wasn't it? And so you started as a group to write a constitutional proposal. And so it's only been 7 years, and it's in Parliament. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to how has that been possible?
Or actually, it started late 2015 when I reached out to my colleagues I knew that are in the field in the context of law. And I asked that, are you interested to write together with others what fundamental animal rights would mean in concrete provisions in the Finnish constitution? And we came together we started 2016 and worked with the proposal, which is included by 5 sections and several subsections. And we wrote it in the form as a simple bill, so that it would be a good tool for the legislator to work with. And we worked with it, or the draft, for almost 2 years. And when it was finished and we sent it out to our constitutional law colleagues and some judges for commenting. And when we thought that now it's ready, the first draft is ready, then we were thinking, what shall we do now? None of us was really familiar with how to take it further. And then we decided on the Valentine's Day 2018 to establish the Finnish Animal Rights Law Society. And what was a surprise for me was that it's really easy for people generally to understand why fundamental animal rights are important. The tough thing is then when the mirror changed towards oneself and they understand that I need to change. I need to change my relation to animals, my actions in daily life and so on. That is the difficult part. But to understand why fundamental animal rights are so important, that's so easy to explain. And the media was quite interested. So actually we didn't need in the beginning to do any lobbying. We were just talking when people was asking us to explain. So it was easier than I thought, actually. Now we have met MPs and farmers, hunters, you name it. We always go to, because it can go under the skin, the discussion, so we can help each other and support. And we know each other so well now, so when we see that someone is upset, we can turn the talk to the other one, and the one who is upset can rest for a moment and breathe. So, and I think it has been a really good thing and a learning curve also that there is always something you can agree upon, and it's okay to not agree, and you can still talk about it. To really find oneself also in the state of respect. And that has been a great thing to learn, and to put that in the context of that, even if you disagree and you think that you're talking with a jerk, you can respect that person because you do it for the animal or the animals. So that has been a really, I think, interesting path to walk. And I hope from my whole heart that we can see one day that also animals' fundamental rights is reality and can challenge human rights and freedoms.
Thank you. And if people are interested, then the bill is also in English on the websites.
Yes, you can find it on a website called Animals Turn, but actually that site will be down after a while, because we are doing new web pages now. But you can find, if you Google Finnish Animal Rights Law Society, you will find, and the proposal is in English.
Steve, you've of course written a very nice, succinct, I'm going to say beautiful book on what are animal rights for, which is kind of like, was my like, phew, as a lay person, now I understand it, or when I need to answer some questions, I'll scurry back to that and got some. But you're going to talk about political representation, which when I came, was introduced to like by other people at Animal Think Tank, like it didn't really make sense to me. I was just like, well, you get fundamental rights, or you get rights or something, and then you get some politicians or commissioner or something to make sure they're enacted. And this is kind of like a reversal, isn't it? It's sort of like you get maybe a commissioner or something, and then you start getting the rights. So you're going to speak to making sense of that, yeah? And I'll pass you the clicker.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I start from the position that we want a world where animal interests are respected, and they aren't at the moment, right? They aren't respected because we leave it to personal choice. And if we think about fundamental human interests, we don't leave those to personal choice, right? If we think someone's property ought to be respected, or their person ought to be respected, we don't leave it to people just being nice and hope for the best, right? We introduce a set of laws, and we back those with a coercive power to compel people to adhere to them. And then that's one of the things that we need for non-human animals. And the other reason that non-human animals' interests are not respected is because they can't speak for themselves. They're particularly vulnerable, unable to represent themselves in political arenas where really important decisions about those interests are taken. And so we have this result where animal interests are just not respected. Political decision makers don't properly account for them. Individuals decide, oh, it's not for me, I don't have to. And so they live their lives in these spaces away from the public gaze, in domesticated contexts, in factory farms, and so people aren't motivated to change things for them. And I think in order to resolve this problem, we need to do two things. We need to introduce a set of fundamental rights, like we've just heard about. Legal rights that protect fundamental interests of non-human animals. And we also need people who are prepared to speak out on behalf of non-human animals, and not just, I think, as private citizens, but in political arenas, because that's where the decisions that really affect non-human animal lives take place. And there are some mechanisms in place that can enable us to do that. And I think some of these approaches are more likely to succeed than some of the campaigning strategies I've seen. So take, for example, the Non-Human Rights Project, who's this really valuable work, but they try and establish legal rights for non-human animals through the courts. And what you often see as a result of that is judges saying, well, yeah, maybe I agree with the idea that non-human animals ought to have personhood and they ought to have rights, but this is a political decision. We can't be making this. You need to go through the legislature. And I think they're probably right. Even if Non-Human Rights Project succeeded in getting those rights recognized, the legislature is going to turn around and say, no, we're going to undo that. And it's not going to take people with them. And I think there are routes to take people with them. And I think part of that involves a sort of gradual normalizing of the idea of people speaking on behalf of non-human animals in political arenas. And I've kind of set out 3 examples of cases like this, from the least radical to the more radical, as a sort of way of taking people along, not frightening them and introducing them to them slowly. So the most sort of common model, you see it in Germany in the commissioner model, or an ombudsman model we see in the UK as well. The idea that there might be someone whose job it is to listen to complaints from citizens and bring them to the attention of political decision makers. So in Germany, the model, they have a federal commissioner and then state level commissioners who act on behalf of animal welfare. And they act as a liaison between animal welfare groups and animal rights groups and industry groups and politicians. They take issues from the public. Now, the weakness of these kind of models is often that it's an advisory role only. It doesn't have any political power. Now, there are models where they have more power. So previously, sadly, this is a role that's been removed, but in Israel, the Knesset had a commissioner for future generations who had considerable powers, the power to sit in committee meetings, to bring, to call debates in parliament. And so these models, although they quite often lack power, they can be built in ways that have a considerably more influence. The slightly more radical view is this. My slide's not great. Okay, this is a model that you see in New Zealand, where a river and ecosystem have been granted legal personhood. And in order to protect the river and the ecosystem's interests, the law states that it has a welfare and that it needs to be looked after. 2 representatives have been appointed and granted legal standing to act on behalf of the river. So there's one from the local Maori community and there's one appointed by the state. And together, these 2, with a set of resources that have been awarded to them to act on behalf of the river, manage the river's interests, look after the river's interests, not on their behalf, but on the river's and the ecosystem's behalf. And they have the power to act as if they were the river, to take on its personhood and speak in debates, to vote on its behalf. And this is the sort of next model that you would see. You'd expect sort of guardians to act on behalf. And this kind of model has been trialled in other places as well. It was a brief attempt to bring it in India to act on behalf of the Ganges, with sort of 3 people acting on behalf of the river, treating it as a child effectively, and they were its guardians or its wards. So that's a slightly more radical model. And then the sort of more frightening one at the end, there are a mix of models here, but a common one you see in Germany is a deliberative model, where the public are commissioned to debate, discuss with the help of experts on a political issue, and then report back to politicians. Often, again, that's advisory. It doesn't have a lot of power. But you can develop more and more meaningful political participation on behalf of animals. So, for example, models you might consider include the idea of people who are political representatives of animals in parliament and have votes that they cast on behalf of non-human animals. So a group of parliamentarians are actually representatives of the non-human world. The thought here is potentially you can, models that have been proposed, these have been proposed both on behalf of future generations, on behalf of the environment, on behalf of non-human animals, include things like individual representatives in a parliament or a particular legislative assembly, like a House of Lords in the UK, with the power to call in decisions, have delaying options, to scrutinise legislation and then send it back to Parliament. These are the kind of models I think I foresee a sort of future where non-human animal rights can really be protected and represented in the future. And just to sort of finish up there, I think, is animal interests, because they're so profoundly affected by the exercise of political power, those interests ought to be accounted for in decision-making. And because non-human animals can't easily represent themselves and their own interests, then the kind of just society we have where we're talking about animals having those fundamental rights that we've just heard about will be one where animals also have political representatives acting on their behalf in our legislatures.
This might be putting you on the spot a bit, but when I was first introduced to the idea of gaining political representations for animals, I was just like, well, that's not going to happen in the UK. But then almost sort of instantaneously, like I'm Welsh, and it's just like, oh, well, we've got the Future Generations Act, we've got the Children's Act, we've got Children's Commissioner, we've got Future Generations Commissioner. So the UK has precedents.
Yeah.
How do you see this,
Well,
the viability of this?
The benefit of doing this slowly and in these kind of steps is that we don't have to radically change our political systems to introduce them. You've talked about the models that we already have, right? And they're familiar to us. We're used to them. So I don't think it's a big step. It's not far from the kind of model that we're already seeing with the Animal Welfare Sentience Committee in the UK. I think the idea is to normalise, just to get people used to the idea that animal interests can be represented in political bodies and people can speak on behalf of them. I'm not frightened of it. I don't think it's a big ask. We just got to tread a little bit softly and avoid some of the backsliding. So, for example, in Germany, some of those models are under threat. The federal level commissioner is under threat, and some of the state level ones are. And the Future Generations Commissioner in the Knesset was removed. But we now have these ideas. They're there for us to use, take forward, and apply in our own context.
Yeah, it's interesting that you used the word normalise there, because I think when I talk to, which is like new for me, going and talking to lawyers, barristers, legal scholars, what's really surprised me is the most consistent sort of strategy they have is talking about, we have to normalise the narrative. We have to normalise this in the judiciary or in legal debates. And that's essentially what I suppose we're trying to do in society, isn't it? We're trying to normalise veganism. And yeah, it's been interesting to me. It's just like, the barrister that we're working with is just like, we will just keep saying the same narrative, and eventually we normalise that narrative within the courts, within the judiciary, and that's how progress and change happens.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you.
Yeah. Joe, a third strategy that we've been looking at, do you want to click on, which was actually Greta from Animal Rising, who did a lot of the work for us on this, who's in the second row, is looking at open rescue as a strategy and attaining sort of the right to rescue. And sort of like if you've got the right to rescue an animal from any factory farm, then essentially there's the potential to collapse the industry. So do you want to talk a little bit about the right to rescue as an objective and as a potential strategy?
Yeah, and first of all, thanks, Mark, for inviting me on this panel. It's really great to be here. So the right to rescue is a term that was coined and popularized by US activists, US animal rights activists, and it's really been Wayne Chung who's spearheaded this, and I'm sure many of you attended his impassioned talk about the right to rescue last evening. And I think the right to rescue, in a nutshell, basically means that individuals have a legal right to rescue animals when they're in distress. And they have that right even if that animal is classified as property within our current legal system and the owner doesn't give consent or authorization to remove that animal. And I think it's an idea, as you alluded to, Mark, that really builds on the idea of open rescue. So open rescue is the practice of liberating animals who are sick or suffering or dying, getting them veterinary treatment and lifelong care, raising awareness about their plight and the conditions in which you found them in. And it's called open rescue because the rescuers don't conceal their identities. They rescue in the open, right? They publicize their rescue, and they do so because they don't think they've got anything to hide, right? They think rescuing suffering animals is the right thing to do. And I think the right to rescue really builds on that idea in the sense that it says, well, not only is rescuing animals the morally right thing to do, but it's also something that is legally permissible as well, all right, which gives a double reason not to conceal your identity, right? You're not only doing the morally correct thing, but you're doing something that is legally permissible as well. And of course, the type of legal arguments that support that claim are going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on the laws of the particular country. And some of the sort of legal theorization around what are the foundations of the right to rescue have kind of been fleshed out in the US context in various cases. In the UK, this isn't an issue that's kind of been explored as of yet, but it's something that, as you said, Mark, people are increasingly interested in.
How do you see the, I suppose, the feasibility of pursuing this as a strategy, and then also the value or the impact? So, Steve said, you can do something through the courts, but then, the legislature steps in and says, oh, no, that's not what we want. So do you want to speak a little bit to the viability?
So I suppose there are two parts to the question there. The first is how to implement it, and the second is kind of what are the risks or limitations of that. And I think in the UK context, the sort of the strongest legal argument for grounding a right to rescue is the claim that, and actually, I should add one qualifier first. When I talk about the United Kingdom, I'm actually talking about England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but not Scotland, because Scotland's got a different definition of theft, right? So excluding the Scotland, I think the strongest argument to say that rescuing an animal doesn't constitute a property offence like theft or burglary is that doing so is not dishonest. So one of the elements of the offence of theft and other offences like burglary in England and Wales and Northern Ireland is that the taking of the property or the appropriation of the property has to be dishonest. And what dishonesty means here is the taking of the property deviates from the socially acceptable standards of society. In order to find someone liable of an offence like theft, a jury has to be convinced beyond reasonable doubt that what they've done is dishonest, that what they've done deviates from society's acceptable standards of behaviour. Now, I think, obviously whether or not a particular type of animal liberation is going to be regarded as a theft will turn on the particular details of the rescue. But let's just take a hypothetical example, right? It's not so hypothetical, actually, but let's call it a hypothetical example. Imagine you're an animal rights organization and you're doing an investigation into a farm, looking into whether there's cruelty or maybe even illegal conduct in the farm. And when you're conducting this investigation, you come by an animal who is sick and needs urgent care. You remove that animal, you get them treatment, you do so openly, you do so transparently. The question is, can a prosecution persuade a jury of 12 randomly selected members of the public that what you've done is dishonest, that what you've done deviates from the socially acceptable standards of society? Now, of course, in addition to the particulars of the rescue, a lot will hinge on who the makeup of the jury is, right? A rescuer might be super unlucky and there might be 12 factory farmers on the jury, right? But I mean, I think at least there's a strong chance with the right type of rescue that at least a majority of jurors, right? You need at least 10 out of 12 jurors to think that you're guilty to be found guilty. I think there's a strong chance that many, possibly most, possibly all of them would not regard that sort of rescue as dishonest. And so then you also asked, Mark, well, what are the limitations to this, right? And this does feed back into what Steve was talking about, that the state is very good at cracking down on behavior it regards as socially unacceptable, right? And if they perceive something to be a loophole or a gap in the law, they find ways to close it, right? So, I mean, an example of this actually is from abroad, relates to Wayne's talk yesterday. He was talking about the rescue of pigs in Utah. And one of the legal arguments made in that case was that the pigs were so sick, right, that they lacked economic value to the farmers. And economic value is part of the definition of theft in many US states, including Utah. Now, the Utah legislature responded by amending the law to close that as a potential argument in theft cases. So that will always be a risk. And not only that, but there's just a huge number of criminal offences out there. I've just been talking about offences like theft or burglary, but prosecutors, enterprising prosecutors, are also quite good at looking through the huge Rolodex of crimes that exist and trying to match one of them to a particular offence, right? So I don't want to mention any live cases, but kind of some charges that have been brought against animal rescuers in this country have included things like animal cruelty, as well as failing to report the removal of an animal. So there are certainly risks as well from a legal perspective.
So I certainly found, whilst we've been exploring this at Animal Think Tank, like none of this is easy. Like just getting my head around one strategy, one objective, like is not easy at all. I lose it, regain it, talk to somebody else, lose it. So I'm feeling a bit bad putting them on the stage and open them to the floor and with questions, but that's what we're going to do. And I've got some help somewhere to go through the Hoover app.
Thank you, everyone who has asked questions so far. Sorry, I'm just getting them up. Okay, so we've got a good number of questions. The first one is, how would the representatives of non-human animals be chosen, for example, for Parliament? Can we still say they represent animals if they will be voted for by humans, especially assuming that not all human voters will have enough knowledge about non-human animals' current conditions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that, I mean, particularly in my field, we've tried to think a lot about. So the people who've been working on this issue have thought about trying to address that worry. And what you want to do is try and establish representatives who can demonstrate that they are acting on behalf and in the interests of non-human animals. So rather than, for example, doing it, some of the sort of citizen jury kind of deliberative democracy routes involve like sortition, random selection. In something like an animal representative, you want to be able to, for them to be able to demonstrate that they were the kind of people who had the right expertise and the right motivations, the right values. And so I would, the kind of route you would take, I imagine, would be through some sort of, like, I've got to demonstrate, right? I've got to show you that I've got the kind of CV that says I've worked with animals, I have the right knowledge, I've been a veterinarian, or I've worked with this NGO, or I've campaigned for non-human animals. And then the public can potentially select from that pool of people. That's one route that might get around that. So that's the sort of standard approach that people would take.
What rights, if any, can be given to animals if they retain their property status? If there are some, should we be fighting for those before we fight for personhood?
There is not one answer to that, of course not. But I would say that, first of all, access to justice, so to say, to have standing, that is one thing. And if you read the proposal that is filed at the moment in the Finnish parliament, you will see that it's a rights catalogue, as human rights are. So there is not one, there is several rights included. I think the content in the rights depend on how we want to safeguard and identify the interests of animals. So if we want to go to the end of it, it's of course included by the rights to life. It's the most at the core of every living sentient beings to live. But it could, on the other end of the dichotomy, we could think of, as we can see in some constitutions in the world now, that there is a state responsibility to take into account the interest of animals. And I think there is much in between those end points. And it's a discussion I think every country need to do in the frame of the legal language and legal system and legal understanding, and maybe, as you said, what can be achievable in a country. I would at the same time say that don't be afraid of to go against the majority. You can just imagine and see in my color of my hair how much I have been laughed at, kept crazy cat lady or whatever, and how often I have heard of it's impossible, it's unrealistic. No one is saying that anymore. So keep the big picture in mind and be brave. And what I also would want to pass to you is that support each other. Even if you are not working on the same issue and you are not agreeing of what is the best way to go, or whatever the disagreement could be of, support each other, because that's really important. It's what we want to see in the world, that we have more empathy and kindness towards animals, and why not start with ourselves? So I think those aspects of our work is even more important than to decide on what is the content in the right itself.
Yeah, I want to add something on the property question as well, because I used to think that property right, the idea of ownership of non-human animals was compatible with respecting their interests, and I've changed my mind since then. And the reason I thought it was possible is because property rights can be configured in lots of different ways. You can see cases where the worry is that with property states of non-human animals, we can just do what we like. And there are ways of thinking about property that don't allow people to just do what they like. For example, in the UK, if you own a listed building, right, you can't just do what you like with it, right? There are restrictions on how much you can change it. And it might be possible in principle to configure ownership rights over non-human animals that protect their interest in quite important ways. But I think this highlights the problem of just thinking about it in terms of pure rights and legal structures, because I think the ownership idea also conveys a set of attitudes. And it's the attitudes that we need to change as well as the legal structures. And that's partly why I think we need to combine the idea of representation with strong legal protections backed up by sort of coercive ideas. I think we have to change our relationship mentally with non-human animals as well as legally.
Yeah, I could add also one thing. that relates to subjectivity and personhood. In the Finnish proposal, we haven't phrased, not a word about personhood or subjectivity or legal status, but we have created through the content in the list of or catalog of rights a same kind of legal platform so that animals and human rights are equal as an outgoing point. So it's possible also to create through legislation positions and status as equal to personhood or subjectivity. So I think we need to be clever in the field of animal law to create new ways so that we can move forward from the fight about personhood or not.
Thank you so much. I think this one might be for Joe. Can you briefly explain what the differences are in how theft is defined in Scotland and what the implication for open rescuers in Scotland would be?
Okay, so the main difference the Scottish definition of theft has from the rest of the United Kingdom is that dishonesty isn't a component of the offence in Scotland. And so I've been arguing that the strongest pathway towards challenging, say, a prosecution for theft or burglary in the rest of the UK is that the conduct isn't dishonest. So that pathway's not really open to, or not in exactly the same way open to rescuers in Scotland. Now, something bit bunged up, something within the ballpark of an honesty defence or in the Scottish context is that there is a defence to theft in Scotland called the claim of right defence. And the claim of right defence is that if you genuinely believe you have a legal right to take another's property, that's not regarded as theft. Right, so if an animal rescuer genuinely believes that when they have a legal right to remove the animal, say they might think they have a necessity defence or some other defence, right? And if they can persuade a court, or at least a prosecution fails to show beyond reasonable doubt they lack that belief, then there's a defence. So there's a sort of honesty-based defence there, right? But it's a bit narrower because within the rest of the United Kingdom, you're arguing that your behaviour hasn't deviated from socially acceptable standards. In Scotland, you're saying, look, I thought I was legally entitled to remove the animal. And if you can convince a jury of that, then you do have a defence to theft.
Thank you. Is there a benefit to changing our focus from the concept of rights for others to active obligations for ourselves? Do you want it again? If there's a benefit to changing, so I guess, is there a benefit to changing our focus from the concept of rights for others to active obligations for ourselves?
I'll go first on that. I don't think so myself. I think the benefit of rights talk is that it centres the rights holder, right? And I think it's the rights holder who matters. From a sort of legal theoretical perspective, though, they are basically two sides of the same coin, because a legal right is standardly understood as the flip side of another person's legal duty. So to say that we owe duties towards animals is the kind of functional equivalent of saying they have rights. But I think sort of discursively, it's not as powerful because it centres us rather than the victims we want to represent.
I can just add to what Joe was saying, that if we think what we try to achieve for animals, it's that we recognize and identify in legal context the interest of animals, and that we can challenge the rights of humans, human rights and freedoms. So in that sense, I think it's of course including human duties. But as Joe pointed out, it's the interest of the animal, the rights of the animal, that is the important issue here. So therefore, if it's fitting in the legal language of a country to phrase it as obligations, okay, fine. If it's working, fine. But I think the word rights is more powerful than duties or obligations. Thank you.
Thank you. I worry that terms like personhood and attributing rivers legal personhood makes us sound very left field. Maybe I'm worrying too much about semantics, but is there a reason we would pursue personhood over other terms?
No. I mean, I think personhood is familiar to lawmakers and lawyers who are doing the sort of work in the background, right? So if you're the minister worrying about how to implement this, you might go to your civil servants and then your government lawyer, and they'll start talking about personhood. But when we're campaigning and we're trying to talk about what we owe to non-human animals, we need to be talking about in terms of their fundamental interests and their rights. And then personhood is just a mechanism for achieving that, and a mechanism for representing them in courts. And as you've seen in the Finnish context, you don't have to use those words to achieve the same thing. So I think you're right. It can get in the way of things, and it can confuse the public. And what we want is a really clear message that gets the public right. We need to convince the rest of our fellow citizens to go along with us. We don't need the majority of them even, right? We've seen that in the UK context, a minority coalition or minority group, as long as it's cohesive, is enough to get some really serious change. So I think we should be focusing on the clear message about interests and rights first.
I'll just add something to that. I think I spent a fair bit of the last 6 months talking to legal people, and a lot of it goes over my head. I get confused. I have to ask them to tell it to me 5 times. So I was a bit daunted when I went to read the Finnish constitution proposal. And then it's short, it's sweet, it's beautiful. You can understand everything. I can't remember anything jarring with me. It's this is just plain common sense, understandable by anyone. So all these legal concepts that we might debate actually are very transferable into everyday language.
Yeah, just to add one thing. I mean, I'm sympathetic to what both you and Steve have said on that topic, but just for a slightly different slant. So there's a famous US legal scholar called Christopher Stone, and in the 1970s, he wrote this famous law review article called "Do Trees Have Standing?" And in the beginning of this, so he's arguing, can trees bring lawsuits? Right? And he acknowledges in the start of the paper, look, this is going to sound crazy. But then he says, look, at one time, it would have been regarded as crazy in this country, in the South, to regard non-white people as persons, to regard married women as persons. And he says, look, ideas that initially sound crazy get normalized over time, and attitudes change. And we've just got to look at how far the idea he's pursuing in that paper in the 1970s has come. There are countries all over the world now. New Zealand was mentioned, but all across Latin America, in Spain, even local councils in the UK now are starting to declare rights for rivers and so forth. So I do think whilst there might be some pragmatism in avoiding these terms, I also think there's a case to be made that normalizing them also has a benefit.
I would like to add to that I think it's meaningful and important to discuss personhood in certain context and with certain audience. For example, within law itself, with lawyers, with legal scholars, and so on. And to create, because the fact is that the concept of personhood is based in private law context and then somehow applied to everything as a basement of law. So I think there is really important discussions ongoing about personhood and legal theory in general, as we have an expert here on my right-hand side on that. And it's really important to find new ways to discuss. But for the legislator and for people in general, the public, it's not important because it takes away the focus from the interest of animals that we need to recognize. And we have been fighting about the personhood too long, because with that we have forgotten the most important being in the context, the animal. So I think it's important to not to just say black and white that no, we don't need to address that. We need to address it, but not with the general public and not with the legislator.
I think part of the learning journey I've been on in the last 6-9 months, like I used to see law as something done by clever people who were powerful. I was probably never going to talk to any of them. It was done, I didn't understand it. It was like a technical puzzle, and it had limits, like it limited what you could do. And now I see it very much as like, oh, well, the law is just another part of our culture. And this essentially is a culture change project. And the law actually just embodies the rules that we as a culture kind of decide we want or don't want. So I think the law can change our culture, and our culture can change the law. And I think I really support, things get normalized. That's what all the lawyers talk to me about, is we normalize the narrative, we normalize the possibility. So I'm very, let's not be limited by ourselves even, and by our own thinking.
What rights would animals have under fundamental rights, and would this apply to all animal species?
Yeah, so I start from the perspective of starting with animal interests. And non-human animals have different kinds of interests depending upon the kind of animal they are. So you've got to think about what are when we think about fundamental moral rights, we're thinking about the kind of interests that an animal cannot live a good life unless they're protected and respected. So for some animals, it's an interest in not suffering. And so that generates a right against being made to suffer. For some animals, they have a very powerful identity that persists over time. They have future-directed projects and memories, and so they have a strong interest in continued existence, and that might generate a right against being killed. Other animals, particularly the kind of animals that we use in our farming and we treat as pets, as companion animals, we can only do that because those are very social animals. And because they're social animals, they can't live good, flourishing lives without good relationships, just like us. And so they might have fundamental rights to have their relationships protected and not interfered with. Other animals can't live out of particular habitats. Very particular kinds of habitat or ecosystem is required for them to live a good life. And that might generate a right to a habitat or an ecosystem. So I think, it very much depends on the kind of animal and the kind of interest it has.
Thank you. We've got time for one or two last questions. So what are the routes for incrementally increasing political representation for animals? How do you see us pushing from commissioners to other forms of stronger political representation?
Now you're asking a political philosopher a question about sociology or political science, and I'm stuck there. But I think the idea is we start with the simple wins. And then once we're used to it, we say, look, there are problems here. We need to go further. Because I think very often our politicians are behind the public. They're more conservative than the public are. So there was a case in the UK a while ago. I don't know if you remember it. It was about Finn, a police dog. And Finn was injured apprehending a robber. A robber stabbed him. And in the the legal case that followed, the judge found that he was unable to effectively punish the criminal for harming the dog for the dog's sake. He had to like convict him for criminal damage to the police property, right? And there was a big outcry from the public, and the public went, "Well, this dog should have rights, right? It should be treated as a police officer and have rights, and it's not the law needs to change." And the government's response was, okay, they knew that this was a way of granting an animal fundamental rights effectively. And so they said they used some smoke and mirrors and eventually changed the law so they increased the punishment if you harmed a police dog, right? So I think the public actually want more than politicians do very often. And I think that's how we persuade them to go further each time. We introduce these ideas, we normalize them, and then we convince our politicians that this is what the public want. They want something better. They want better animal rights or better animal welfare. And this is the best way to achieve it. And, it's just a gradual process.
I could add one example from Finland, how we have been working on that issue. Everyone is busy today and everyone has too much work. And the MPs usually doesn't be expert on actually anything. They are really good in their own work, but they don't have the expertise. So what we have been doing is that we do it easy for them. So we have everything ready, the proposal or suggestion ready for them, written, so they can use it. So I think whatever you think is best in the UK and in the legal system here, just make a proposal or write it down and have concrete examples of how it could be achieved or how the system could be working. And at least it's a good starting point to start to plan how it could be achievable. So therefore, for example, our proposal is as a bill, written as a bill, so it's easy for the legislator and the MPs. When it was discussed in the, do you call it plenum, when all the, in the big hall, so to say, when everyone is at stake, we gave every MP a document on, I think it was several pages, on questions that has been addressed along the way from the MPs or anyone, and we gave the answers. And every MP who spoke at the in the plenum was using the answers from our document. So it was actually the animal's voice, or our voice, our representatives of the animal's interest that were spoken at plenum. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, that do the work for them and make it easy for them.
I'd like to thank our panelists, particularly Brigitte coming from Finland for the conference. But especially like to thank you for doing like maybe decades of hard labor that can help activists, all of us here in the room, to actually pursue some of these strategies. Because like I said, like I can't get my head around it. So I'm going to be coming back to people like you time and time again. And I think it's very much, I used to see the law as something separate, but now I see very much as something that all of us can engage in. And I'd also like to thank you, Brigitte, for trailblazing for us with a very bold initiative in Finland and showing us that it can be done.
Oh, thank you. It's my honor to be here presenting the proposal, and thank you for the invitation. And everyone is doing such an amazing work. So I encourage everyone to do whatever you think is best for animals, but think what power we could have all together on behalf of the animals if we could agree on the fundamental changes in the society. I think we could be really powerful, as is the other side. which have a lot of money and the mechanism to lobby. And I think we could achieve that if we work together. And now I talk even globally and on international level. So, but with that said, I think we need to learn to be also kind and supportive to each other, towards each other.